But when my dad ripped my full-ride college scholarship letter into pieces, it felt like my entire future was being shredded. I had spent 4 years sacrificing everything to earn that envelope, only for my parents to smirk as the confetti of my hard work drifted onto the dinner table. Dad looked me dead in the eye and said, "No daughter of mine needs school. You're staying here to run the family business." My mom didn't even look up from her plate. She just nodded in agreement. My lawyer told me there was no legal way to force them to let me go. Everyone in our small town thought my fate was sealed. But they completely forgot about my quiet, unassuming grandma sitting at the end of the table. What she slid across the mahogany would next turn my dad completely pale. "My name is Chloe, and at 18 years old, I learned that the people who brought you into this world can be the exact same ones who try to destroy your future." For 4 long years of high school, I didn't have a social life. While my peers were going to parties, football games, and beach trips, I was locked in my room studying until 2 in the morning, maintaining a flawless GPA. My goal wasn't just to graduate, it was to escape. I wanted a ticket out of our suffocating, small town, and I found it when a thick envelope arrived from Columbia University. It wasn't just an acceptance letter, it was a full-ride scholarship. My tuition, housing, and books were completely covered. That evening, I proudly placed the letter next to my dad's dinner plate, my heart hammering against my ribs with pure excitement. I expected a smile, maybe even a look of pride. Instead, the room went dead silent. My dad didn't even read the whole page. He just stared at the Ivy League logo, his jaw tightening into a hard, angry line. Without saying a single word, his large hands gripped the edges of the paper. The paper ripped. The sound echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. He tore my hard work in half, then into quarters, until it was just a pile of worthless, white scraps. "No daughter of mine needs school," he growled, tossing the pieces into his mashed potatoes. "You're staying right here to work." I stared at the shredded remnants of my future floating in the grease of my father's dinner plate, my breath catching in my throat. I looked over at my mother, desperately begging for her intervention with my eyes. But she just stared fixedly at her own hands, completely silent, before giving a slow, submissive nod of agreement. "Your father is right, Chloe," she whispered, her voice devoid of any warmth. "We need you here. Family comes first." That was the ultimate lie. This wasn't about family unity. It was about protecting the family golden child. My older brother, Brandon, was 21 and a total disaster. Our parents had poured their entire life savings into sending him to a prestigious state college, only for him to fail his classes, spend his tuition money on partying, and drop out within his very first year. Despite his laziness, he was the son, which meant he was automatically entitled to inherit the family's construction supply business. The problem was that Brandon couldn't even balance a checkbook, let alone manage commercial inventory or run a payroll system. My parents didn't want a successful daughter. They wanted a free, highly capable administrative assistant who could quietly do all the hard work behind the scenes while Brandon took all the credit and profit. They expected me to sacrifice my intellect, my ambitions, and my entire life just to prop up my brother's fragile ego and keep their failing business afloat. As Brandon sat across from me, a smug, arrogant smirk spreading across his face, a crushing wave of isolation and betrayal washed over me. I realized that to them, I wasn't a person with dreams. I was just an asset to be exploited. The next morning, the sun rose on what felt like the first day of a prison sentence. I couldn't eat, and I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. Desperate for a lifeline, I waited until my parents left for the warehouse before locking myself in the hallway closet. With a racing heart, I called a local family attorney whose name I'd found online, praying there was some legal loophole that could save me. I explained that I was 18, that I had a full-ride scholarship waiting for me in New York, but that my parents were refusing to sign the financial aid waivers or release my paperwork. "Chloe," the lawyer sighed, his voice heavy with professional pity. "Legally, at 18, you are an adult and can walk away. But practically, it's a minefield." He explained that because my parents had insisted on keeping all my summer job earnings in a joint bank account, my dad technically had full legal control over every single dollar I'd ever saved. If I tried to sue them for the funds or contest their guardianship over my assets, the legal battle would take months, if not years. By the time a judge even looked at my case, the fall semester deadline would be long gone, and Columbia would be forced to give my spot to someone else. I hung up the phone, sliding down the closet wall into the dark. The system was rigged against me, and my time was rapidly running out. 3 days passed in a tense, agonizing blur. I moved around the house like a ghost, ignoring the enthusiastic wedding and college plans my friends were sharing on social media. On Thursday evening, my grandmother, Evelyn, came over for a mandatory weekly family dinner. Grandma was a quiet, elegant woman who usually kept to herself, rarely interfering in my father's loud, overbearing household dynamics. As we sat down around the large mahogany table, the atmosphere was suffocatingly smug. My dad poured himself a fresh drink and immediately began to brag about my future, as if he were doing me a massive favor. "Chloe's finally growing up and learning her place," he boomed, gesturing toward me with his fork. "She's going to start training under Brandon on Monday. No more of this ridiculous fantasy about moving to New York City. Family business is where the real security is, right, Brandon?" Brandon grinned, nudging my shoulder mockingly, while my mother offered another one of her quiet, approving nods. I kept my head down, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill onto my plate. I felt completely defeated, trapped by the people who were supposed to protect me. Suddenly, a sharp clink shattered the room's noise. We all froze. Grandma Evelyn had set her fork down onto her porcelain plate with a terrifying, deliberate precision. The entire table fell dead silent. Grandma didn't yell. She didn't look angry. She simply stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from her skirt, and slowly began to button her heavy winter coat. She looked directly at my father, her eyes cutting through his arrogance like ice. "Go pack your bags, Chloe," Grandma said, her voice dropping into a calm, unshakable command. "She starts at Columbia in the fall." My dad burst into a loud, mocking laugh, the sound echoing off the dining room walls. "Evelyn, have you completely lost your mind?" he sneered, leaning back in his chair with casual arrogance. "You don't dictate what happens under my roof, and you certainly don't tell my daughter what to do. I run this family, and I run the business. Chloe stays here." Brandon chuckled along with him, shaking his head at the sheer absurdity of an old woman trying to challenge his father's absolute authority. Grandma Evelyn didn't flinch. Her face remained completely expressionless as she reached into her vintage leather purse. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and slid them across the polished mahogany table. The paperwork glided past the serving dishes and stopped right in front of my dad's plate. "Open it," she said softly. Dad's smirk finally vanished, replaced by a look of deep irritation. He aggressively flipped the top page open, expecting to find useless old family papers. But as his eyes scanned the text, the remaining color drained entirely from his face. His jaw went slack, and his hands began to visibly tremble. "What is it, honey?" my mom asked, her voice cracking with sudden panic as she leaned over to look. What my dad had hidden for years had finally caught up to him. To avoid heavy commercial taxes and protect his assets from potential lawsuits, he had quietly placed 51% of the family business's land and building deeds under my grandmother's name a decade ago. He thought she was too naive to ever realize what it meant. But the papers Grandma just produced proved that she legally owned the very ground the construction supply company stood on. "You have until Monday morning to sign Chloe's university release forms and transfer every single cent of her stolen savings into a private account," Grandma stated, her voice as cold as steel. "If you refuse, I will execute an immediate commercial eviction. I'll lock the gates, seize the inventory, and shut down your entire operation by Tuesday afternoon. The choice is yours, son." The dining room erupted into immediate, absolute chaos. My dad slammed his hands onto the table, his face turning a furious shade of purple as he stared at the legal deeds. "You can't do this to me, Mom," he screamed, his voice cracking with a desperate mixture of rage and panic. "This business is everything we have. If you shut us down, you'll ruin Brandon's entire future." Brandon's arrogant smirk completely vanished, replaced by a look of sheer terror as he realized his lazy lifestyle was about to disappear. My mother began to sob openly, clutching at my dad's arm and begging my grandmother to reconsider. But Grandma Evelyn stood there like an unmovable fortress, completely unaffected by their theatrical panic. She didn't argue, she didn't yell, and she didn't back down. She simply looked over at me and gave a gentle, reassuring nod. For the first time in my life, I felt a surge of absolute power running through my veins. I stood up from the table, turning my back on my screaming parents and my terrified brother. I walked up the stairs to my bedroom, pulled my suitcase from the closet, and began packing every single thing I owned. Downstairs, I could hear my dad frantically trying to bargain, offering to sign whatever papers Grandma wanted if she would just tear up the eviction notice. When I walked back down into the foyer with my bags, the paperwork was signed and the bank transfer confirmation was sitting on the counter. I didn't say goodbye. Supported by Grandma, I walked out the front door and never looked back. 3 months later, I was sitting on the green lawns of Columbia University, watching the autumn leaves fall across the campus. The air was crisp, and for the first time in my 18 years, I could breathe freely. Thanks to Grandma Evelyn's unyielding courage, my savings were safely under my own control, and my Ivy League education was officially underway. My parents tried calling and texting a few times, spinning desperate excuses about how they were only trying to protect me, but I blocked their numbers. They chose to protect a lazy legacy, so they could live with the consequences. Grandma told me that the family business is still running, but under strict new conditions, and Brandon actually has to work a real shift now if he wants a paycheck. This journey taught me that sometimes the people who are supposed to build you up will try to tear you down to serve their own greed. But it also taught me that heroes come in the most unexpected forms. Now, I'm curious about all of you who listen to my story. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have stayed to save the business, or walked away like I did? And has anyone ever stepped up to save your future when you felt complete? Let me know which city you are watching from so I can see how far my story has traveled. Don't forget to hit